Welcome to November 1994. 30 years ago this month, because we're in November 2024 now, almost to the end of 2024. Where did this year go? Either way, here we are now, and as usual, we are going to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of all of the old head-worthy happenings that occurred 30 years ago this month in November 1994. Now, this was my junior year of high school, and probably around this time is when I started planting the seeds of what would eventually grow into my very first band that I would start in the beginning of 1995. So sometime around here, because I remember the catalyst of it all was my buddy wanted to start a band with me and wanted to play the drums, and he decided to ask for a drum kit for Christmas. So sometime around now, the holidays start happening and we start talking about, hey, let's start a band. And I'd already been writing songs, as some of you already know. And so I was more than ready. So sometime around now is in the talks about all that started happening. And it's meaningless to most of you. So let's get on to some meaningful stuff, like the number one albums in the country. All right, the number one album for the first week of November 1994 was the album Murder Was the Case from Snoop Doggy Dogg. I believe at this point he was still just a doggy. And you know what? Aside from the song Murder Was the Case that they gave me, I don't think I've heard any other part of this album. I feel like I should do something about that. But yeah, that was number one for 2 weeks, for the first 2 weeks. Did I say the first week? It was number one for 2 weeks in the beginning of November 1994. For the third week, the number one album was actually one that I bought and one that I have here on vinyl, and that was the Nirvana Unplugged in New York album. Now, this also came out in November, so I'm going to be talking about this in a little bit, so I'm just going to put this away, and we'll discuss that one later on. And then for the last week of November 1994, an album that I did not give two shits about when it came out. And lo and behold, today, the same amount of shits are not given for this album now. That is the Eagles with Hell Freezes Over, a band that I don't remember anyone my age being interested in, who were never going to get back together. And then they got back together, and everyone my age just went, okay. All right, moving on to the cinema. What were the number one movies in the country for November 1994? For the first week, we have a holdover from last month. It's its second week on the top, and I still haven't watched it, but one day I will, and that is Stargate. Honestly, I didn't even know this movie went number one week, let alone two, but I guess it was successful enough. There was a TV show. I think there were even fucking toys for this movie, but obviously, it just went right past me, and I don't remember anything about it. For the second week of November 1994, the number one movie in America was Interview with the Vampire, starring Christian Slater and other people. Honestly, that's probably a pretty good glimpse into my 16-year-old mind. I was probably like, oh, Christian Slater's in this movie. Oh, but he's not in it very much. Who else is in it? Oh, never mind. This one I did eventually see, though, and I was underwhelmed and thought it was just okay. But also, I'm not the target audience, so don't listen to me. Speaking of also not being the target audience, for the third week of November 1994, the number one movie in the country was Star Trek Generations. Now, I'm pretty sure I did see this movie in the theater because I was a fan of the old school Star Trek, and I watched a little bit of The Next Generation, and my older brother was a big Trekkie and also into Star Wars and Doctor Who and all that shit. So I'm pretty sure I went with him to see Star Trek Generations, and I just remember that the two shows were in the same movie together, and that's all I remember. Actually, that's a pretty cool idea, really. I guess maybe that's one I should check out again. Finally, for the fourth week of November 1994, a movie that I will not ever check out, I have not ever checked out, have no interest in it whatsoever, to each their own. The Santa Claus. Whatever hype was behind this movie was completely lost on me because I never watched one episode of Home Improvement. That's the one he was on. And so when this movie came out, I'm like, oh, a guy from a show I don't watch in a movie about Santa. I'm fucking 16 years old. Get this out of my face. All right, moving on to the albums released in November 1994. The 1st of November. There's a few releases this day to talk about, but first up, we have the 6th album from Megadeth, Euthanasia. I would like there to be a vinyl reissue of this, please. I'm putting that out there. Please, somebody, don't remix it and remaster it. Just repress the goddamn thing and let me buy it. Anyway, funny enough, at the time, I wasn't really that into this album. It was one that I liked a couple songs, but then years later, I revisited it. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is really good. And I think I probably said on the Cranked and Ranked we did of Megadeth, I think that Euthanasia is the best like vocal performances of Dave Mustaine. And just some amazing songs. They just happen to be slower and a little more moody, I guess. And you know me, I always enjoy it when bands switch things up. And this is a really good example. They would actually switch it up even more than this. And I would also love that. But that is for a year way down the line. But Euthanasia from Megadeth. All right, now also released on the 1st of November 1994, Nirvana. Unplugged in New York. The MTV Unplugged released as an album. So I talked about the actual Unplugged performance way back on a different episode of this when it was broadcast, and I watched it the night it aired, and I loved it, and I've loved it ever since. It's possibly my favorite MTV Unplugged performance. And but then again, yeah, I'm a little biased because Nirvana is one of the most important bands in the world to me. So of course I love it. And the cool thing about this, when this came out, is that it actually had extra songs that weren't on the actual broadcast. So those of us who recorded the show on our VCRs back in the day and watched it over and over again, we finally got to hear some different tracks from the performance. I do have to say, though, that out of all the Nirvana things, this is the one that I've listened to the least, mostly because whenever I feel like listening to the Unplugged, I just watch it instead. But it does sound amazing on here. And it's always a little bit bittersweet listening to this because it's such a great performance that I love so much, but also it's really the last thing that Nirvana would do that a lot of us would see. And then a few months later, of course, we lost Kurt Cobain, and this one came out about a year after. I think it was in November 93 that the broadcast happened. So this was about 1 year after that. It's weird to think about things like this because this still feels like it just happened recently sometimes. And then I have to remind myself that I'm making a show called 30 years ago this month. Woo! Also released on the 1st of November 94, the second solo album from Tom Petty, Wildflowers. This is obviously the newer version of this on vinyl, but it's weird to call it a solo album because his band was still just Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and this is Tom Petty with some other dudes, but it's considered his second solo album, and it's such a great album. Obviously, if you know this album, you know what I'm talking about. It's amazing, but I mean, what Tom Petty album isn't? So, and man, I still remember on MTV. So I was still at that point watching MTV quite a bit, and they would play the video for You Don't Know How It Feels a lot. And I really liked that song. I liked that song then. So of course I would watch it every time it came on. And I think the majority of the times I heard the song, it was like that and not like it was on the album. And they had to edit out the part where he says, roll another joint. So in my head, the song always goes, let's get to the point. Let's roll another or whatever it was. That was kind of a cool way to edit out a word that they couldn't air because it's like it's saying all in one note and then you just reversed it. So yeah, that's pretty cool. I always like clever ways of censoring things instead of just completely cutting it out or fuck, even worse, having a beep. I mean, imagine if my videos had that kind of shit. Most of the words would be cut out. All right, moving on to November 15th, 1994. The second album from T-Boz, Left Eye, and Chili, TLC, Crazy Sexy Cool. This album fucking rules. Now, that being said, I do think I like their first album, Ooh, on the TLC tip, more than this one, but this one's fucking great. Man, just the fucking singles, Creep, Red Light Special, Waterfalls, all on this album, man. It is, I've talked about it before. I love a lot of that 90s R&B, and TLC they're still around. Rest in peace, Left Eye. But they were one of the best doing it at this point, in my opinion. All right, moving to November 22nd, 1994 for our last release this year. Vitology from Pearl Jam, the third Pearl Jam album, and quite possibly my favorite Pearl Jam album. Ask me again later. Honestly, after this, they started to lose me, and I cared less and less about their stuff. Still think they're a great band, but this to me is like the pinnacle of their cool shit. Before this album came out, my older brother, who worked at a record store / video store, gave me a promotional 7-inch that had Spin the Black Circle on one side and Trimmer Christ on the other side. And those are both fantastic songs. So I was ready for this album when it came out, and I loved it. I still love it. It's an amazing album. Just in case you're somebody that's like iffy on Pearl Jam, I would say that this is a really excellent place to start. Vitology. Hey, we actually have a VHS release to talk about this time. It was released on November 15th, 1994. And yes, the Nirvana talk is not over, because this motherfucker came out. Live Tonight sold out. I got this when it came out. I was so fucking stoked about this because it was advertised as kind of a weird grouping of live and TV performances that was put together by Kurt Cobain, or at least it was started by Kurt Cobain. And then after he died, the rest of the band got together and finished it up. And this thing fucking delivered. The first time I saw this thing, I was like, this is the best fucking collection of things I've ever fucking watched. It is just, as a Nirvana fan, this is a must own for anybody. It obviously is on DVD at this point, so if you want to, I think you probably also just find it on fucking YouTube or some shit. Anyway, I love this. I always thought it was very interesting because there's a section of the video when you get closer to the end when there's always kind of like weird noises and weird edits going on of stuff that, you know, kind of in between songs or kind of weave in and out of songs. And then it gets to a point where later on it starts to show all these different like news clips and interviews and stuff. They're all happening rapidly, kind of showing that, oh, they're popular now and they're famous now and they're having to do all these things. And then there's like these noises from other clips that are like rising in the background. And that moment in the video always just made me think, is this what it felt like for Kurt Cobain? Like this section right here, like everything is just moving too fast and there's just like constant noise and sometimes you can't make out what's going on. I feel like, I don't know if that was his section. Did he work on that section or did the other two guys? Either way, it's fucking brilliant. I could talk about this all fucking day. All right. Released November 15th, 1994, live tonight, sold out. So yes, that is it for November of 1994, but who wants to go back another 10 years? Oh, okay. All right, here we are, November 1984. Now, for these segments, I would just highlight one album or so to talk about, and this one is an important one for me. I was 6 years old at the time, and this was my introduction to this artist, and you can imagine what that kind of did to shape my 6-year-old brain. But I love this album, and I love Madonna. Now, we talked about Madonna last time. Look, I get to talk about Madonna again. Like a Virgin came out on November 12th, 1984. This was Madonna's second album, but it was like her big, huge fucking breakthrough. Obviously, the big hits off of this one, the song Like a Virgin, and of course, Material Girl, which would give her the nickname that people even still fucking use today. Look, there's the back cover with Madonna. Anyway, so I don't know how, but I got my parents to buy me this album on cassette, and I loved it, and I've been a Madonna fan ever since. This is where it started for me and for a lot of people with this album. And yes, I did stare at this picture quite a lot when I was a young person. Okay, fine. I still stare at it all the fucking time. All right, you happy? All right, anyway. All right. 1984, November 12th, Madonna, Like a Virgin. Fuck yeah. All right, that is it for November. And so we have 1 month to go for 2024, 1994, before we move into sort of a weird hybrid version. I don't know if hybrid's the right word. Yin-yang version of the show. I talked about it last time, where some months, depending on what I have to talk about from either 95 or 85, it might be a show focusing on a year of the 90s or a year of the 80s. And then, at the end of the episode, vice versa, it'll be, did any of that make any sense? Don't worry, it will when it starts. I'm a professional. All right, well, that is the end of this episode of 30 Years Ago this month. Thank you all for watching. You're all beautiful, and I will see you all again next month.